1, 2, 3. Interview John Cook on December 8th. What's today, 9th?
9th,
Yeah,
yes.
9th. Okay, my nose is... I
have a rumpled up napkin if you are not too picky about what you want.
As long as you have
They're
used
here.
it before, right?
It's clean, it's just been in my pocket.
Okay, that's fine. It's kind of a boring background.
You know,
I think that background for me would be better, but...
if the roles were reversed, I probably would be recording it and
Well, yeah,
asking lots of questions.
Yeah, well, even if you're pure of heart, if you post it, Michael Mann or someone sees it and pulls a soundbite out and tries to, who knows what they're going to do. I just want context. That's all I really care about. Thank you. Okay. That'll be a good shot right there. All right, let's go.
Are you recording?
I just need the headphones. Yeah, it's recording, so everything's all set.
Do you want to do the intro first and then...
Yeah, we'll do that.
So what we normally do is just...
So can I look at the camera and say, "Hi, students, don't believe your teacher." That'd be fun, right? I mean, you wanted this entertaining, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
But usually we have the interviewer just give their name, what group or organisation they're with,
Okay.
and what they do.
Okay.
It'll be interesting to hear how you characterise what you do.
Okay. Well, now I can add a few things. Star of stage, screen, and television.
Did you want us to do a little mic test?
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Oh, hang on, better wait for the phone.
Alright, yeah. Can you just tap your microphone for me? Great. And you? Oh, good. We're rolling. Okay, so...
So name, group,
Okay.
what you do.
Ready? Okay.
Yeah, in the camera.
My name is Marc Morano. I'm with the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow, and also I publish the website Climate Depot, climatedepot.com. I'm also the star and producer of Climate Hustle, coming to a theater near you soon. Star of stage television. I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV, occasionally. There you go. There's your Merchants of Doubt moment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I already saw that.
Yeah. I was the villain in that. The next movie I'd like to play a romantic lead. So hopefully someone will recast me. But sometimes you get typecast. I don't know if I'll break out of that mold.
Right. Okay, so we'll jump straight into it.
Go ahead.
And just to let you know what we're doing, I'm just trying to really understand your views about climate change.
Okay.
And the climate issue in general. Firstly, is global warming happening?
Okay. Yes, it is. Global warming is real. It's happening. It depends on timescales, obviously. Now, notwithstanding the Michael Mann controversy, if you go since the medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300 AD, you could say that we're not global warming. We've actually maybe cooled or stayed steady if you just go from the high point to high point. If you go from the Little Ice Age, which you could say ended about 1850, certainly the globe is warming. If you go since 1900, certainly the globe is warm since 1900. Now, if you go... Here's where it gets interesting. If you go since about 1930s, depending, obviously the global data sets show we've warmed since 1930s. However, in the U.S., the EPA still on their website shows that the most heat waves happened in the 1930s. And that's also a period when the Arctic and Greenland were comparable to today in terms of, there's actually peer-reviewed studies showing that Greenland warmed more rapidly in the 20s than at least it did back in, I want to say the late 90s or early 2000s. So, and then the Arctic, many articles and other studies and data, Russian ships showing the Arctic was going to melt, a lot of fear about that. And there's actually other fears going back. Even 1817 worried about, from the UK Royal Society, worried about Greenland melting. So in terms of global warming happening, yes, the Earth is warming. But the problem with that phrase is it implies that when people associate global warming with man-made global warming. In other words, is man driving the warming? Absent man, would it be? And that I won't get into now, but the Earth is warming. Let's say that.
When the IPCC, I guess, talk about global warming, the period they're mostly interested in is just over the last few decades.
Is it 1950 forward, correct?
Well, yeah, so 1950, and in particular, I guess, 1970, when they say that the modern global warming trend started. Do you think that since that 1970, that it continues through to today?
Well, here's what's fascinating about that. If you look at the data sets, and Anthony Watts and Steve Goddard, Tony Heller, and even Judith Curry and others, if you go back to like 1970s, the cooling that they showed back then, I want to say it was I don't know if it was NASA, it was one of the agencies. But now if you go back and look at the same data, that cooling has been revised, shall we say, out. And so if you go back, my point being is if you start in 1970, you can show a more dramatic warming than if you start, say, in 1950 or 1940, because that was during a cooling period. And when you talk about Arctic ice, for instance, the satellite monitoring went up at the end of a cooling period. There was generally considered to be, whether it was caused by aerosols or some other factor, from 1940 to maybe 1975 or so, a cooling that was going on, and it sparked controversy, whether it was wide or whether it was not. I don't even want to get into that issue. Certainly wide in the media. Let's just keep that. I think we can both agree on that. We can dig up stuff. If you start as your point in 1970, you're going to be able to show more dramatic warning. A lot of environmental groups do that, in the U.S. especially. Oh, since 1970, we've at this rate. It's kind of unfair because that's a really cool period to start. Not as in hip, but as in a cooling period to start. So if you start later, say 1990, or if you start earlier, 1930, I think you would get different results. Of course, then you get older and older thermometers. But go ahead.
So with global warming, it's not just a temperature record. There's a whole range of, I guess, metrics or signs of warming. What do you think about other signals besides just a temperature record, such as what's happening with ice, what's happening with sea levels?
Right, and now sea levels is for the lay person like myself, a very complicated issue, and here's why. I can have scientists look at this and say, okay, the gauge data that's from the sea is actually showing no acceleration, but when they switched, was in 92 or 93 to satellite monitoring, there was a jump. So, and then there's also the isostatic adjustment that they add to it, and then there's also the different time scales. Now, interesting enough, I actually have Michael Oppenheimer saying sea levels decelerating in the film. He misspoke when he said it, but we had some fun with it. But
was he meaning accelerate?
He meant to say accelerate, yes. But
I'm sure you provided the full context of.
Well, no, I just put it in. No, he's very clear that he believes it's accelerated, but I'm just saying he had the one moment. But from the understanding I see, the temperature, I think, what's it, about 5 inches? If you're 50 years old, you've seen about 5 inches of sea level rise, if I'm not mistaken on that. But if you go by the sea level gauges as opposed to satellite, by the ground monitoring, you don't get a big acceleration. You probably get almost no acceleration. It's certainly not anything alarming. If you go what you add in the satellites and if you do adjustments, you can then come up with scarier projections. But from my understanding, there's nothing alarming going on with sea level at the moment. Now, you mentioned ice. Antarctica, wow, it's all over the place. I believe you did a study about East Antarctica losing ice, and there's been contrary studies. There really has been a lot of studies back and forth. Most recently, a NASA study showing that Antarctica is cooling enough to offset the Western Antarctic ice loss. Interestingly enough, in 1979, in the film, and actually on my website, I go back to 1900 with scare stories about Antarctica melting. 1900, the West Antarctica, 1920s. Then we go to 1979, Stephen Snyder talking about DC monuments underground. Well, guess what? 20 years later, in 1990, or 11 years later, Paul Ehrlich does something for the Today Show. Same thing, the DC monuments underground from Antarctica. Then guess what? 2014, the Union of Concerned Scientists, same exact thing, the same visuals of the monuments underwater. If you go back to 1975, the National Science Foundation glaciologist, whose name fails me, actually says that the West Antarctic ice sheet melt has nothing to do with the climate, meaning nothing to do with man and climate. It's something that's been going on for centuries, and it's not something that we created. And that's interesting, because if you're talking about in the context of ExxonMobil, what did they know? The National Science Foundation knew that West Antarctica wasn't caused by mankind back in 1979, the melt. Same theory, by the way. Stephen Snyder, in 1971, I believe he was with the NCAR, said a doubling of CO2 won't be catastrophic because it would saturate in the atmosphere and have it cease to have a heating effect, in layman's term. So you could argue that NCAR and our federal agencies knew that doubling of CO2 wouldn't be catastrophic. Now you could say, well, more science came along. But that's what, same thing happened with ExxonMobil. We have scientists in our film testifying that they believed in global warming in the 80s, and the evidence has since turned against it, citing the Antarctic ice core data now. I'm giving you probably way too much. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, that was a bit of an info dump, but...
Well, wait, say it again?
Well, no, it's fine. But
you said a bit of a what?
Info dump. I'm just
info dump. Okay, I'm trying. Yeah. Well, you have on video.
But that's kind of what I expected, because you talk very quickly.
I talk quickly. My brain is like crammed up with stuff. So go ahead.
So Renko, I mean, as you say, 20, 35 years ago, a lot has come since then, and a lot of studies have been published that are linking human activities to warming, which therefore is causing melting of the ice.
These studies, we actually interviewed a scientist in our film who says, I said, is more CO2 equal a warmer world? And he says, well, I don't know, but it's easier to say that a warmer world equals more CO2. And they talk about, geologically speaking, back in the geologic record, that the CO2 in our atmosphere today is actually one of the lowest points it's ever been, geologically speaking, and then temperature is one of the coolest it's been, geologically speaking. So if you look at it in the long term, it's not alarming. The question then comes down to, out of all the various factors that influence climate, is CO2 the control knob? When you, John Cook, just cited that the studies link it, most of these studies are modeling studies that say, okay, the only way we can explain temperature increase today is by CO2. We've eliminated the other factors, and that's just nonsense, because even as several UN scientists, including Trenbrith, and then the guy from New Zealand, whose name's failing me, admitted that models don't account for half the variability in nature. So the idea that models can be attribution studies doesn't cut it. So I think people assume, and they do modeling studies, and they sort of group around a consensus, but that's what I think the whole debate is about, whether it actually is the control knob versus a warming agent that is a contributor on the outside, and whether you can distinguish CO2's impact from natural variability. That, to me, is where the debate is. So you just can't use phrases like global warming or climate change or is man responsible. The question is man responsible for how much?
I guess the evidence on whether man is responsible or not. I mean, models is one of those pieces.
So what would the other? Give me some others then. Educate me. And I mean, in terms of what you're thinking, so I can respond to what else you're thinking.
There's a climate scientist in Australia, Carl Braganza, who's done a number of human fingerprinting studies. Yeah. Which is actually looking at empirical data and what patterns they present and the different patterns.
But you have to be specific.
I know. So yeah. For example, one pattern, which was predicted as far back as the 1850s, is that if greenhouse gases are causing warming, then you expect to see winters warming faster than summers. Okay. You expect, if greenhouse gases are trapping heat in the lower atmosphere, then you expect to see the upper atmosphere cooling while the lower atmosphere. Okay, and even if that's fine, and then I think Pat Michaels has actually dealt with this head on, and then the issue there is, yes, there is a greenhouse effect, and yes, mankind can have a temperature, but the question is it the majority? Is it distinguishable from natural variability? And that's where you look at the data. And that's where you look at reality, is what I'm saying. For instance, UN reports and others are claiming that the weather is at an all-time extreme. You'd have to see unprecedented things. Now, we know that hurricane activity is not showing anything alarming. Now, forget about even the landfall, but I mean, even the tropical cyclone activity, the ACE. Ryan Maui has done studies on that, who does the hurricane research. And then look at tornadoes. We know that big tornadoes in the United States are on a decline since either the 50s or 70s, and there might be more tornadoes because we can measure them. You look at droughts. We have Roger Pilkey Jr. citing that study in Nature saying on 60 years there's no trend in droughts. And then you have, and globally, and then you have floods. There's peer-reviewed studies and hydrological journals showing up to, I think it's 117 years with no trends. Now, you can look at California, you can look at specific stuff. You can go on 10-year timescales, 15-year timescales and say, oh my gosh, the drought is much worse than it had been the previous 15 years or even previous 20. But it doesn't tell you on climate timescales. So I know skeptics are accused of cherry-picking the data, but I truly believe that the evidence shows that the skeptics are right on this, particularly with the extreme weather and particularly even with the global temperature. And here's a question for you. You have to be appalled. I don't know what's going to happen this year, 2015, but 2014 being declared the hottest year by hundredths of a degree, and they admit that the data margin of error is tenths of a degree? Are you, John Cook, aware of that? And does that appall you in any way, that they would make that claim? It's a political claim. You cannot say that's science. The way science works is you provide a best estimate with a range of uncertainty, right?
Right, but the range of uncertainty means it's not a record. It's statistically a dead heat is the point. In other words, are you ready for this? The pause still lives even in these hottest year claims.
So I mean,
but seriously, look that up. I mean, students, don't take his word for it. This is John Cook. He's a lot invested in it, and people would say I have a lot invested in it too. But the point is, that's really an insulting thing. I call it a political statement when they say it's hottest year. They could say it's tied for hottest year. I'll accept that.
So I mean, you just mentioned the pause. So I mean, that's well. And when we were asking, is global warming happening? We've kind of accepted.
Well, I did since 1850. Okay, since late 97, during the height of the El Nino, if you use the satellite data, either Roy Spencer, but either University of Alabama Huntsville and or the RSS, Remote Sensing System, you will get 18 years. Well, this isn't going to be anyway. The point is, you'll get 17, 18 years currently in end of 2015. That's probably going to drop because of the monster El Nino. However, that still exists. And actually, if you go back to 92 or 93, the satellite RSS was set up to be more accurate than the surface temperature. That's number two. That's point number two. I don't even remember what point number one was. But anyway, the land data is currently showing that, again, these hottest years, it's statistically within the margin of error. So they can't even make that claim other than just being silly and making hundreds of a degree temperature claim. In terms of the new study from NOAA, the problem with just going back and saying we redid the numbers and hey, Shazam, the global warming pause has been erased. That's like a company losing money and hiring an accountant and saying, hey, we hired a new accountant. Guess what? We're making money now, so no one worry. We're not losing money. There's something just that smacks of agenda there. And when you look at it, these are activist scientists, Tom Carl. We had the head of NASA, being James Hansen, the head of the NASA record keeping. This is not a dispassionate, I shouldn't say honest, but a scientist of high integrity when it comes to the record keeping, because this is the guy who's personally invested, arrested half a dozen times as a NASA scientist protesting global warming, endorsing a book calling for ridding the world of industrial civilization. It tends to make people suspicious that when they what's the word I'm looking for, adjust past temperature and make the past cooler so they can show more of a warming trend, that we don't believe them. If you go back to NASA, Hansen, 1999, NASA's lead global warming scientist, he actually says there was no warming trend in the United States as of that point. But now if you go back, they've revised the numbers enough so that they've cooled the past so that there is a warming trend. So we, as skeptics, not only do we question the data, but you got to look at who's in charge and the methodology. We know that David Deming, a geologist, was approached by another scientist saying we have to get rid of the medieval warm period that appeared in the original 1990 IPCC report. That was subsequently, Michael Mann came and that essentially was wiped out. And that had huge howls of protest, even from people who agree with you, like Richard Muller from California. So we know that they have to question this because it's a campaign cause. And I think, aside from data for a moment, the reason there's so much skepticism in the US is because it's so easy to show that these are not neutral, unbiased scientists. These are campaign cause. It's a political issue. It's a partisan issue. They're campaigning to make you believe global warming's worse. IPCC, Rajendra Pachauri, the head of it, actually said, wait till the next IPCC report. It'll be so alarming, the world will have to act. The head of the UN climate panel also said, global warming is my religion. And the head of the vice chair of the IPCC, Edenhofer, said, we will redistribute wealth by climate policy. So here's the thing. Before any American, who you could argue is not up on climate science, even gets to hear the science, they know that the UN is involved. They know that it's a partisan issue because Al Gore is the face of it. And they know that NASA's lead global warming scientist is a hardcore activist who's endorsing books calling for ridding the world of industrial civilization. They know that the head of our National Academy of Science, Ralph Cicerone, has taken money from Congress and lobbied for cap and trade bills. They know it's politics heavily steeped in it. Now, we got to go back to the science. I got off track there, but my point is, you want to understand skepticism, you have to understand that this is the science narrative of our day. And it's heavily politicized. This is not Spencer Weir, if I'm saying his name correctly, W-E-A-R-T, the science historian. I actually read some of his great material and watched some of his speeches. Science was different until about the 1970s when the era of the mega science conferences came along. I would argue that these mega science conferences contributed to this groupthink among the scientists that ended up bringing out this whole narrative of global warming. Because if you go back in time, there would seem like such a diverse opinion of scientists back pre these big world science conventions and annual meetings. And then after that, there just tends to be, when you have all these meetings and all these same group of scientists, and particularly with the IPCC, you definitely get into a groupthink mentality. And you see that from the ClimateGate emails, regardless of whether you think whatever they were vindicated or not. We have the scientists from Michael Mann and Trenbith and other ones openly talking about, that journal editor, we don't like him. I went to a solar conference, they weren't buying this, and we're going to have to we're going to have to basically tell these people that they're not going to be published unless they toe the line. And we had Edward Zorito and others say, when they came out against the scientists, that I may never be published again, but they had had enough. And there's something there. And I think when you talk to your students, anyone out there in the online course, you need to understand the context for this. This isn't pure, unadulterated science. It's a political movement. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
I mean, you talk about politicization.
That's, of course, on both sides.
But I mean, the results of NASA, they're replicated by labs all over the world. So I mean, and they're all working independently, finding independent results.
But I'm talking specifically about the temperature data, and I'm talking. But see, people don't. To the public, they're not looking at. They're looking at the broad statements that scientists make, and then you have to look deeper, and that's what the skeptics are doing, is looking deeper, and the statements aren't supportable. Your 97% study, President Obama is now saying 97% of scientists believe global warming is man-made and dangerous. Did your study find that they believed it was man-made and dangerous, or they just believed it was man-made? Because there's been many conflations, I believe, of your study. I'll give you a chance to tell me if you believe that. I mean, your study didn't find that it was dangerous, did it?
No, we didn't talk about dangerous.
And
there's been many characterizations of our study that
but that's what happens. It was you and on the other side, I can do something that some of my stuff gets mischaracterized by skeptics in the media and gets juiced, if you will, But your study, particularly, from our own president, and many people will say 97% agree it's dangerous and it's an urgent matter that must be acted upon. They take liberties with it, and that's part of this whole thing that gets politicized. So anyway, go ahead. Next question.
Well, I mean, and talking about groupthink, now we're talking about consensus, and so. I think that the public don't even realise that 97% of climate scientists
and you know what?
Agree that
they shouldn't agree with that, because it's a bogus number. So, notwithstanding, I'm talking to the author of the most famous 97% consensus study.
Well, and that's an important point.
Yes.
The most famous, there are actually a number of.
Well, I know, but you're the most famous. Maybe you're not. I don't know. What's the other one?
There's
or something?
There's actually been a number of studies.
Yeah, I know.
Peter Doran in 2009.
Peter Duran, yeah.
William Anderegg in 2010.
Yes.
Ours in 2013. Stuart Carlton in 2015. Yes. And all of these taking completely different approaches, different methodologies, all finding this.
But they've all been also picked apart extensively by people examining. I remember the one, it was the Duran study. So it was down to 75 out of 77 scientists. So here you have and how many of your students would be shocked to learn that one of these 3 or 4 studies showing the 97% consensus wasn't even 97 scientists. It was 77. They couldn't even get 97 scientists to make up 97%. That's just nonsense on some level. It's a game you're playing.
Well,
game.
It's a statistics. That's how surveys
work.
Did
I say game? No. Statistical.
Well, when you do a public poll, you don't poll the entire population. You take a sample, and then the smaller it is, the bigger the uncertainty.
But no one's caring about the uncertainty. Now maybe it's hidden in the paper. My point is that's not the way these studies are used. They're used as a form of silencing the opposition.
But are you familiar with the numbers in the other studies? So, for example, William Anderegg
I remember
had 908.
I remember that the Anderegg study, if I'm not mistaken, and there was so much criticism of that as well. I don't.
What can you think of any? Because there was very little.
Is that the one that listed the scientists? Is that the one that had names?
It was accused of listing the scientists, but it didn't.
Well, the baseline, there was on a blog, and they used my original, 700 scientists dissenting as part of it. Yes, I remember that well now, and I remember it was either Roger Pilkey Sr. or Jr. trashing the study and going through the methodology. I mean, so there was heavy criticism of that. You're talking about years for me to remember that one. But
the criticism about the list, regardless of whether they did or not, has nothing to do with the methodology, though. That's just whether.
Well, it's about where your source material is from, and then whether you accept that kind of source material and how they put these together.
Well, if you're the source material, you'd probably approve of that.
Well, I remember him having a source material of interviewing skeptics, but anyway. So the idea, though, that you mentioned, like, for instance, people. I just had the Smog blog interview me, and they're like, "Oh, the National Academy of Science, American Meteorological, all these scientists agree, and they're part of the consensus." American Meteorological Society and NAS and all these other science bodies, 24 governing board members, steeped in politics, tied to funding, all get together, and 24 people decide we're going to endorse the UN climate view. And meanwhile, the rank and file aren't informed or don't have a direct vote on this one way or the other. In the case of the American Meteorological Society, they actually did surveys. One showed up to 75% of the rank and file scientists, meteorologists, were skeptical, at odds with the board's consensus. And the NAS and in other AGU and other groups, there's been rebellion among their ranks to fight back against these kind of consensus things. I think the reason you did a study is because it's a talking point and it's an activist sort of thing to try to silence everyone, to marginalize anyone who disagrees. It shouldn't be about that anyway, but since you made it about that, then we're going to go after that. And I remember in 2009, they had a World Federation, I don't know, it wasn't World Federation of Science, it was a science meeting, and it was like 2/3 of the presenters were skeptical of it. And this was during a time when everyone was saying there's no scientists that disagree. My point is, you have the UN, they handpick scientists from around the world, they come, and of course they're almost all going to agree. Now the ones that don't, the Chris Lancy's resign in protest, the Roger Pilkey Sr.'s resign in protest, Richard Toll's hanging on for the moment, I think he's still considered the lead author, and many other resignations and people that are just left in disgust. We feature some of those in the movie. That's not, the UN is not a view. You can't say these are the world's top scientists. If you really think Kevin Trenbreth, who I think has diminished himself considerably by saying that all weather events are now, I don't know if he said caused or influenced by man-made global warming. Yeah, but that's like saying everything you do all day is influenced by God. How do you prove that? That's an insulting thing for a scientist to say. I think he's diminished himself greatly. And Michael Mann, is just a thin-skinned little activist that even his fellow colleagues, most of them can't stand. And in fact, I love Mark Stein's book on that just shows Michael Mann for what he is. These are activists. Michael Oppenheimer from the Environmental Defense Fund took money from Barbara Streisand. He's now portrayed as this neutral, erudite scientist from around the world. He's an environmental activist who has a PhD, but he's going along, and you could argue, the skeptics have, Fred Singer or this and that, but the point is, they're portrayed, the skeptics are diminished, and the media portrays all these scientists as though they're neutral, all the global warming scientists. You have to admit, you have to tell your students, this is not a fair game here, because the media and the United Nations involvement here and this whole idea of all these different talking points, it's all designed to just create a consensus. Not a consensus happened by accident. It was designed to create it.
That's a really good point.
We have a point. The point in the movie actually says they came up with a 97% figure, and then they did a couple, are you ready? Quote, dopey studies to prove it. And you would be one of the dopey studies, Don. Sorry.
Well, I mean, we discussed the whole, we collaborated on this study, right? And then every private discussion we had about this study was stolen and published online.
Sure. Yeah.
And if we had decided it, pre-decided it, did you want to?
It's okay. I'll get away.
If we had pre-decided a 97% number, that would be in the discussion.
I'm not saying, yeah. Okay,
but anyway, I think it's an important point that, is the consensus manufactured or did it just happen naturally? And that's a really important thing. And the reason why we did this study was because, you're talking about all these individuals. What we wanted to see was what did the published peer-reviewed research say. So we weren't looking at what does this guy say or this guy or this person. What does the published
But here's the thing.
Say?
There's like 3 or 4 studies, so I hope I'm not conflating. I won't say this is specifically yours, but many of these 97% studies go back, and it's like, I know Naomi Oreskes would probably be the first one in the recent time to do this. She didn't actually look at whether. Many of these studies, if a scientist does a study, for instance, this recent NASA study that showed Antarctic cooling, in these types of studies where they do something that's against the narrative, for lack of a better word, the scientists are always now go to great pains to say, well, this doesn't question, I still believe that mankind is driving. They put in all these opinions and they take an approach. So in other words, if you study butterflies, and no one's paying attention to your research. If you do a modeling study that says, how will butterflies fare 75 years from now in the American Southwest, and you come up with 3 ranges, okay, moderately impacted, or horribly impacted, then your university press department says, let's go with this. Butterflies may be doomed in one of our scenarios. Suddenly, you're getting media, you're getting attention. Suddenly, Naomi Oreskes could be looking at it and say, look, even this butterfly scientist accepts global warming. So there's another peer-reviewed paper supporting global warming. When all it is a modeling speculative study by a guy who never even looked at whether CO2 was causing the warming in the first place. That's how you pack it in. Though you build it, they will come. The money comes in for all this funding, and I'm not saying all the scientists are bad. The butterfly guy I just gave you isn't an evil guy. He's just doing work, trying to get attention, trying to get more funding. But suddenly, he's going to be part of the 97% consensus. He's going to be feeded in the media. He's going to be scaring school kids that butterflies may be doomed because one of his 3 modeling scenarios shows it. Admit this. I want you, John Cook, to admit I'm saying something sensible. Am I or not?
Well, I think that what you're doing is what you're accusing others of, which is politicizing science.
No, I'm trying to give you a scenario, but go ahead.
Because what scientific understanding is about is collecting all this evidence through multiple different studies and then considering the full body of evidence.
Okay.
And it's when you look at all these...
I agree with that, but here's the thing. It's not neutral, because if you look at what happens before every UN conference, and they're usually late November, early December, there's all these studies timed, and Seth Bornstein, the AP, is right there to play the stooge for everyone. But they're all timed to make everything look like it's all bad and we must act. They're timed. The scientists know it. They know they can get attention. They know they can get funding. They know the university will be happy. They're timed because there's a movement afoot to solve the crisis. And that's why this is a campaign cause. This is not neutral science. I would agree with you. 40 years ago, we could have had neutral science. That's why when you go back to the 1970s cooling, you can say there was no consensus, or these studies can claim that, because there was such a diversity of opinion. And that's before, or right when the era, according to Spencer Ware, when the mega science conferences started. And that's my theory. I'm not attributing that mega conference of causing the groupthink to Spencer Ware. I'm saying that's my analysis of it. So.
That's a good question. I'm just curious. So we're talking about this bit, and you're accusing it of being politicized.
I mean, I'm not accusing, that's a fact.
Yeah, all right.
I mean, not so much any specific thing, I'm just saying the whole movement is politicized. You have to admit that, especially with the UN's involvement.
Well,
can I finish my question? Within a human system, right, where all people, all science is done in a political background. Everything that humanity has done is in a human background. So if you're studying cancer, at some point as a researcher, you're going to say, I have to tell the world about cancer. And it's an important message. You're going to be very passionate.
Good point.
It's the same thing about poverty. It's the same thing. Anything anybody does, if they're good at it, they're going to try and attract attention.
But here's the problem. With cancer, as an example, if you're a researcher and you have some major breakthrough that goes against what people had thought, there's a lot of encouragement. You would be feted with a Nobel Prize. You would be famous. You would be like, your colleagues would be patting you on the back. In this, it's almost like if you try to dissent and talk to Judith Curry or someone else, you're suddenly considered a heretic. Your Scientific American's got a heretic on the headline. It's not encouraged. Where I argue in scientific medical research at this point, it is encouraged to do that. But now it's like heresy. We can't do it. So I think it's been... The difference, again, is there's no annual UN meeting on... If there was an annual UN meeting on the war on cancer that everyone must agree and there can be no dissent and we must do this, then you would have... And it all depended on one view, then you would have that in medical research, but you don't. Climate science was basically destroyed as a neutral science, as an objective science, in 1988 when the UN started this whole thing, because they just turned it, and it had such a corrosive impact all the way through, and then it became political, and then you had presidents talking about it and supporting the UN and Kyoto, and then everything was just geared toward that. Talk to Will Happer, who was with the Department of Energy at the time, and Al Gore, Al Gore met with him, and Bill Gray was the hurricane expert. When they found out that they weren't on board, they made it very tough for both of their careers. Bill Gray got funding dried up immediately, the hurricane expert, after his meeting with Al Gore. And Will Happer, when they found out he wasn't on board, was basically booted out of the Department of Energy, or his time was up. But this is what I'm talking. And we have now a current in the U.S., one of Obama administration's cabinet said, there's no deniers in my agency. Imagine if you were a scientist in the agency, I think it was the Energy or Commerce Department, and you had a view that you didn't agree with. Well, you better keep your mouth shut. That's not how science is done. I just want you to acknowledge that. You don't have to agree with skeptics scientifically, but at least agree that this is out of control. RICO statutes, crimes against humanity, criminal statutes at The Hague from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Nuremberg-style trials by David Roberts, Grist magazine, and on down. It's out of control. It's out of control, and that affects the science. Not just the science, it's the presentation of the science. What studies you pick, what points you make. If you're going to talk about sea level, are you going to talk about the gauges, or are you going to talk about the satellite level, which showed a big bump after they switched? Are you going to talk about the land-based, or are you going to talk about satellite temperature? You're going to talk about the adjusted land-based. You're going to ignore satellite. I told Seth Bornstein, fine, talk about hottest year all you want. You can even ignore the 100th degree. But at least it mentioned that 2 other data sets of satellites show there's a pause. They make it look like skeptics are on some island like hottest year, but skeptics still think there's a pause. We don't think there's a pause. There's 2 satellite data sets that show it. Why is it so difficult? Why am I yelling at you? I got to calm down. Go ahead.
So, but the way I see it, Mark, you're conflating the political.
But I'm saying the politicals affected it. I'll talk science then. Let's forget the politics.
Okay. No, but you're right. It has affected it.
It has.
And there has been.
But you would argue the other way, right? You would argue skeptics have affected it disproportionately.
Well, no. I mean, that's a separate thing. But even the scientists who agree with the consensus, like there's been empirical studies that have looked at what the mainstream scientists are saying about climate change, and they're like 20 times more likely to underestimate climate impacts than overestimate. Like this is an empirical study. These are quantitative numbers.
What does that mean? You mean their predictions versus the reality is worse? Is that what you're saying?
Their predictions are
But what time scale? I don't know that.
Well, what the study did, this was by William Freudenberg.
Yeah.
He looked at the predictions of the IPCC, and he found that when you go after the predictions and see how those predictions fared, they were observed to be 20 times more likely to be underestimating the climate.
So the time scale is the first IPCC, second, where are we, 1990, 96?
The study was 2010, I think, so it was probably talking about the
first one.
The fourth assessment report.
So 2001, you mean? So
no, 2007. I would have to confirm.
2007. Oh, wait, you're telling me it's a 4-year time scale?
Well, it's looking at any observation.
But that's a short. I don't even know. I don't know. I'd have to look that one up. That sounds very. All I know is the models. Depending on. Again, I know Gavin Schmidt's been touting out saying that John Christie's studies modeling charters wrong, but the models have generally overheated in terms of temperature from their predictions. And again, it depends what data set, what adjustments, and whether you're using satellite or land-based, and what time scale.
I'm curious. Have you ever highlighted the fact that the IPCC underestimated the amount of sea level, like sea ice retreat? The fact that the Arctic sea ice was predicted
from what year to what year? Yeah, well,
the 2007 they predicted that Arctic sea ice would go like this, and it actually went.
It went down, and then sort of it's actually somewhat recovered, but
even the recovered bit, which is
right, but these are
is still below the.
Yeah, but I mean, when you're talking about a prediction of something like that, and then one big drop. I mean, they also, I think it was IPCC 2001 predicted Antarctic sea ice would diminish, and then that hadn't happened. And here's the problem: you have David Viner predicting more global warming will mean less snow. Snow is a thing of the past. Michael Oppenheimer I tried to ask him about this, but he got cut. He had to go. He talked about his daughter's sled not being able to be used because global warming was causing less snow in the American, particularly Northeast. He was in New York. The New York Times had it, and he's at Princeton. So yeah, he was in the East Coast. So then we have the snowiest winter on decade, and now you have all the same, not necessarily the same, but now the narrative has changed that global warming causes more snow. So the Boston blizzard and the record snow is being blamed on global warming. So I don't know, when you get into predictions, I found a whole bunch of predictions Michael Oppenheimer made that were wildly off on sea level and other things in the 90s. I asked him about it, and what he said was, well, I may not have gotten those right, but who could have predicted? And then he picked a bunch of other stuff that ended up happening. Well, that's not fair. If you're going to say a bunch of predictions and then bring up something that, okay, I was wrong on those, but I didn't predict this, it's like, well, what are you talking about? Then it's like, that's this nonsense. But I don't know. On those short time scales, I wouldn't go. But all I know is if you look at what's unprecedented in the world today, that's what you'd want to start with. So I'll give you the floor. Is the Arctic unprecedented? Is sea level unprecedented? Is temperature unprecedented? Are polar bears? What's unprecedented in your mind?
Well, what's unprecedented, what really jumps out to me is the fact that atmospheric CO2 levels now are the highest they've been in like over millions of years. Right.
Well, okay. Couple things on that. First of all, that doesn't prove anything because geologically speaking, certainly going back millions and billions, and unless you're a young Earth creationist, I believe you believe the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old.
Are you?
I don't think you're. No, I don't think you're a young Earth creationist. But so if you go back, CO2 is not historically high. As I said, we have Robert Geoghegan, the University of Pennsylvania, the former chair, done peer-reviewed studies, traveled to Antarctica, did field studies all over. He actually says we're at one of the lowest points for CO2 in the history of the Earth, and we're at one of the coolest temperatures. That's to start with. Now, you mentioned the CO2 being the highest. There was a study peer-reviewed a few years back that showed CO2 levels over 400,000 about 10,000 years ago. Now, it may have just been a one-time snapshot, but there is something in the record 10,000 years, so you don't have to necessarily go back millions. So, and I'm not necessarily endorsing that, but I remember reading that, so I could refer that to you. In terms of that, though, that to me, that doesn't prove anything. It just proves that CO2 is rising. The question is CO2 the control knob? Is CO2 going to cause a climate catastrophe? That's sort of designed to scare people, just to say, oh, it's the highest level in this. It doesn't mean anything. So what? I mean, there's a point where I think it's below 150 ppm that plants would start to starve. Right now, there's actually been studies showing that we've greened the earth with it. So it all comes down to, yes, CO2 is rising. Is it causing catastrophe? Has it overcome what some would say are hundreds of factors to be the control knob of climate? And where is your evidence for that? I will give you the floor again.
So on the question of control knob,
control knob.
I think it's interesting. I've often heard the argument that when you go back millions of years, that CO2 is actually significantly higher than it is now, which is true. It's like many times higher than current levels. What I've never heard from people making that argument is the fact that as you go back there, the sun actually is solar activity is lower. So it's like about 5% lower. And when you combine the two...
you have a weaker sun. Yeah, but that, again...
Well, that means that when you combine the two, they pretty much cancel each other out.
But we also don't know about oceans. So there's so many other factors, though. Here's where I split.
See how you suddenly shift to
there's no shifting. There's no shifting. You're just picking one of other hundreds of factors and saying, well, that factor was less, so that would explain it. No, that's the same thing they do with modeling studies. Well, we counted for these 5 factors, and this CO2 is the only way you can explain it. No, the point is, you go back, and there's hundreds of factors that influence it. Yeah, maybe the sun was weaker, but who knows what was going on with ocean cycles and everything else. The point is there's no evidence. You can speculate that it may be the sun, and that could have had an influence. When you look at all the factors that influence our climate, for them to come out and say that CO2 has now, and Al Gore will say this blatantly, has basically overtaken everything else, and we have the Union of Concerned Scientists in the film saying, it's our choice how fast the sea levels rise, basically whether we regulate CO2. And that brings it into a whole other agenda here. When you have, in America, EPA regulations, we have our president saying that, we need to do these EPA regulations because we have to diminish the storms. We're having so many bad storms. Well, wait a minute. EPA regulations won't even affect global CO2 level, which therefore won't possibly affect climate. So how is it ever going to affect storms? And we have the UN basically saying we're going to have a 2-degree C limit, which... the Climate Gate's Phil Jones has admitted was, quote, plucked from thin air, the number. It's silly to think that we can sit here on the margins. Hundreds of factors influence our climate. The UN is here this week, picking one politically selected factor, CO2, trying to tweak it on the margins, and then come up with temperatures of 100 years from now and 2 degrees C and beyond. This is modern witchcraft. I think you should admit that. Your students need to know that. In fact, in our movie, we have a whole section on how witches were thought to control the weather. There was actually a consensus that witches controlled the weather, and anyone who didn't agree with that was considered a sorcerer. We actually go through and we compare it and all the predictions, and now they think our SUVs and our coal plants are controlling the weather. It's a madness that's descended upon it, and your role in it was the 97%, and that's where you need to repent at some point for your role. And what I mean by that is I'll be nice to you. I'll be nice to you. You don't have to recant your study, but you should occasionally do a blog when President Obama misrepresents you and says 97% think it's dangerous and we must act, when Greenpeace misrepresents you, and Sierra Club, when the UK Prime Minister, you ought to correct your side occasionally on it. I try to correct my side if they get too far. Like Donald Trump, I cringe when he says it's a snowy day in New York, what happened to global warming? That's not a good argument. I cringe at that. I'll say that publicly all the time on the radio.
Like we debunk alarmist myths in our course as well. But
who?
We, in our course, Denial 101, we also look at alarmist myths that go the other way.
Okay, that's good.
But... now I've lost my train of thought.
You got let's do 3 more questions. Yeah, we're really getting late.
5:35, so I'm not sure what time we're
Yeah, let's do 3 more, and that'll probably be a half hour. The way I'm talking, I'll try to shorten them. Go ahead.
So I had a blank because you were saying something.
Well, you said something about your courses. You do debunk alarmists, overly alarmist myths.
So I guess I noticed that you often make this about individuals. And to me, this is about the body of evidence. This is about peer-reviewed science.
It's about the UN and the leaders, but it is about peer-reviewed science, and that's the thing. I can cite you. I think I have over 1,000. Someone's been collecting them on. If you take Greenland, for example, I've done a whole report, just peer-reviewed studies showing Greenland is not, comparing it to the 1920s and 30s. That's peer-reviewed science. Okay, that's on Greenland. Then you go to the Arctic. I can cite all these peer-reviewed studies supporting a skeptic's case on that. That's peer-reviewed science. Then you go to Antarctic. I can support all these peer-reviewed studies supporting our side. Now, the problem today, not today, but always in science, there's dueling studies. You have one study saying Antarctica is losing ice. You have another saying it's not losing ice, it's cooling. One's from NASA. One's from, what's the guy's name from Real Climate? Eric, you know his name, his last name, Eric, whatever. Anyway. The point is, there's dueling science, so it depends on what you want to pick, first of all, in many cases like that. And again, Michael Oppenheimer is using the satellite data to say it's accelerating. If you use the tidal gauge data, it's either not accelerating or much less dramatic than
But the way the science works is it's not your evidence versus my evidence. It's considering the full body of evidence.
It's the full body. But the problem is...
And you mentioned the global warming target of 2C being a political figure. I mean,
well, I'm saying I'm quoting your scientist, meaning someone you probably respect, Phil Jones. But I'm quoting, but that's just on your side. On my side, I could be much less charitable. The idea of 2C, I said witchcraft. I mean, if you actually believe they can tell us the temperature 100 years from now based on what they agreed to at a UN summit, even if the countries follow the emission, that's wacky, and that's seriously unscientific and scary that any scientist would actually believe that.
Well, it's not based on what the UN decide. Like there's the community of coral reef researchers have issued a consensus statement saying that coral reefs can't survive global warming of more than 1.5 degrees. And
because of temperature or ocean acidification? What are they referring to specifically with that statement?
It's the combination. It's that 1-2 punch of the warming from CO2 causing acidification and causing bleaching.
I've talked to people, oceanographers, and went from Israel and other places at Hebrew University. They've evolved with CO2 many times higher, when you could argue it was even more acidic than they have now. So it's hard to believe that would doom them. But
it's the rate of change, because because corals have a long lifespan, so they can't. Bacteria maybe with a lifespan of a very short period,
I
can evolve to adapt.
I don't know, but see, the thing that you just said there is the community of coral researchers. Well, keep in mind, they're on this. That's the problem. Would they be issuing that kind of a consensus statement if there wasn't all this politics, UN, funding, all involved? And that's what I'm saying. Science has changed since the 1970s in fundamental ways. So I don't necessarily believe it. I could show you a bunch of science and scientific studies and scientists who disagree with that alleged consensus statement. I'm not familiar with the exact one you referred to. So I guess what I'm getting at here is it's a quest for consensus, and you're like the biggest cog in the wheel that's promoting that. And
so can I ask a follow-up question? I'm just so to me, like I've worked in research before, and you're saying they have money and they have fame and they have media. I think most scientists, especially within marine biology, which is my background.
Fame, I'm not really saying fame.
Okay,
I'm just saying they get attention, meaning for the university and their study. It's not like they're going out and people
But
are
they can't survive without that, right? You're demanding that scientists be neutral. And implied in that statement is saying that they don't get money, that they don't get funding, that they're not affiliated with the community. And it's not possible for an individual human in living in a capitalist society to do that. So don't you have an impossible expectation?
Not at all. No. I'm talking about like the butterfly scientist. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't unethical. He wasn't seeking fame or fortune or money. He's just seeking attention and seeking to advance his science. And he does that theoretically speculative modeling study. There was a scientist whose name I'm trying to think of about last spring who said that he actually spent more time on the press release to his study than he did on the actual study itself. And this press release took like months. They were trying to get it just right. That's a very politicized. Do you know who it was?
I don't, but like knowing scientists and knowing how scientists work, that guy is very much an outlier.
Okay, all right. Well, I was. To me, I just trying to remember his name. I could give it to you. It's on my website. But he literally encapsulated, because it just shows you how intense everything is. And the other thing is, and Fred Singer actually pointed this out one time. These studies that, like, for instance, the NASA study that showed the Antarctic's cooling, anything that goes against consensus, they will go out of their way in the study to make sure that they know they're part of the consensus. Because in the past, they haven't liked it, and I think the guy's name is Duran. That's probably why he did the consensus. He did the original, was he the one that did the original? Doran. He did the original Antarctic study, correct? That showed it was cooling East Antarctica. And then he was cited by Michael Crichton and all these other skeptics, and then he got mad and did some kind of blowback, and then
his work was taken out of
context. His work was taken out of context. So now, I think he was the model. Now all these scientists, whenever they do something, they know it's going to be an inconvenient fact. You know what I mean by that. They'll put in all these things saying, of course they support the consensus, and this does no way take away from it. It's like a fear that there'll be, that they're afraid of skeptics. They're afraid of being labeled as one. They're afraid of being part of that, and it's just not a good atmosphere right now for real science.
And someone murders someone with it, maybe from then on when you invent tools, don't kill people with them. Like if a scientist feels they've said something really important, and then people...
No, and I'm not even saying he did wrong. I'm just saying that since that time, I think scientists preempt that now by putting in, he wishes he had done that, put in a preemptive thing.
And I think, I'm pretty sure you would understand why consensus is important. Like we go back to Frank Luntz and even earlier, the famous Frank Luntz memo.
I know what you're talking about, yeah.
Saying that if people think that the scientists don't agree, then they don't support policies to mitigate climate change.
Right. It's about.
And studies have shown that casting doubt on the level of scientific agreement is the number one strategy.
Yeah, a new study just said skepticism is deadly effective. When they hear skeptics. The problem is you guys have overreached significantly. And again, even your study, the way it's used by saying it's dangerous global warming, and, we have the clips in our movie, CNN, everyone just goes like, we have one clip from ABC News of the reporter saying that it's widespread agreement that global warming is the most serious and life-threatening issue facing the Earth. And then we have people saying it's the greatest issue. It's just, you guys have overstepped. Here's basically, let's step back from the science 1 second and just say, why are you guys frustrated? If you believe it's all done deal, here's why. The UN got involved. The UN is massively distrusted, certainly by Americans. And frankly, if America's not on board, you guys are going to have a major problem globally. Al Gore became the face. Al Gore was the loser, some would say the winner. The closest presidential election in history is one of them, and he's a partisan figure. So right there, you've split off half of America. And then you get the overreaching claims when you have people like James Hansen, Michael Mann, and just the nastiness and the pettiness and the calls for jailing and the calls for crimes against humanity and all this stuff. It just turns people off. The basic comment would be, and we had Mark Stein testifying, a writer testifying in the Senate hearing yesterday, Ted Cruz's hearing, and he actually said that people instinctively know that there's something wrong with your theory when you don't want debate, when you don't want to allow it, when you just say all scientists agree. That's the refuge of scoundrels to say they all agree, no more debate. No more debate. That's what he was referring to specifically.
But what our study found was there hasn't been a debate in the scientific literature, and the public think that there is an ongoing debate amongst climate scientists.
Just to pause, I'm going to give you guys a hard 5-minute warning. So
right.
have you?
Okay. And that's the key thing. Like this isn't an imposed consensus. This isn't a small group imposing.
But that's wrong. But as I just told you, in the scientific literature, let's pick any subject: Antarctica, Greenland. I can point out peer-reviewed studies that support a skeptic's position that it's not alarming and not unprecedented.
Well, we've looked at all the literature, and that presence of a dissenting view on the topic of human-caused global warming is. Well,
now you're talking about Now you're not talking about. You're talking about specifically whether CO2 is the fingerprint. Well, what study? What's your end-all be-all study that shows CO2 is the driver of climate? And don't tell me the CO2 levels are high. And don't tell me.
I mean, that's a really good question.
But that's the central question, because everything else is window dressing. If you go through, and here's the problem: you can't look at.
Can I answer the question?
Okay, but you can't.
Before you get too excited.
Okay.
So you asked what is the be-all end-all study? It's not one be-all and end-all study. There's a whole range of studies looking at this from many different ways, finding many different human fingerprints, finding many different patterns that all confirm humans are causing global warming. And that's why I'm so confident that we are causing it, because the evidence just keeps piling up in different ways.
I need to hear this evidence. I mean, we hear that all the time.
Well, I mean, I started to describe it. We've got the pattern of the yearly cycle, the pattern of the daily cycle, the pattern of the structure of the atmosphere. We've got satellites measuring heat escaping atmosphere.
But that's verifying a greenhouse effect. It doesn't say, like Fred Singer's point is this: yeah, man can cause global warming, but it's insofar it's indistinguishable from natural variability. What study can you say is going to go after that, other than a modeling study that's excluding factors? I'm going to have to go. Just excluding factors that the model puts in.
We'll probably call it a day.
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Any final remarks?
My final remarks are, this is the science of our day, but it's also become the madness of our day. The idea that we can pass legislation and control this, and I would just urge your students to have an open mind, to start looking in this. And in almost any country in the world, there are scientific skeptics in these countries just disgusted by what they're seeing with this whole idea of consensus studies. And to you, John Cook, I want you don't have to recant your study. I won't. I'll let Richard Toll and others go after you on that. But I want you to really make it a point and send it to me. If I could even send you some quotes of people who've misused your own study and juiced it to way beyond anything you would be comfortable claiming or anything your statistics showed. Let's both try to do that. I'm trying to keep my politicians honest in a way. I go after Trump and others, and